Hello again. Now what we're going to be discussing is governance. And governance within the framework of a strategy and trying to understand how to coordinate the strategy of a company through the side of corporate governance. So within this, we are going to be discussing or clarifying stakeholders because this underlines much of the discussion on governance and what are stakeholders, what are the different types of stakeholders, how do we understand the relationship between a company or in general an organization with its various stakeholders. And then the idea of corporate governance, the idea of trying to ensure that we're going to achieve the desired objectives and the different ways in which we can coordinate all the individuals in the organizations to achieve this. And then going slightly deeper within the coordination of management and the role that not just the internal, but also external mechanisms and the ones in between, like the board of directors play in trying to ensure that a company sets objectives, sets a strategy, and this is going to be achieved as a desired. So let's start thinking about the stakeholders. First thing to understand what is the definition of stakeholder. It does appear in lots of publications, in lots of newspapers, in basically a general concept. But the important thing here is within the world of strategy, any group that is affected by the actions of the company can be considered a stakeholder. It's not only the ones with which we have established a relationship, but others that are affected. And this is an important distinction because it basically goes back to the notion of externalities. What are externalities, actions, unintended consequences of the actions of a company that provide something positive for other groups, and these groups do not pay for these benefits, or that provide something negative, a harm to certain individuals, certain groups, and these groups are not compensated for the harm they have been receiving. So this is the story of externalities, and this is why we need to go beyond the traditional focus on these are the individuals in the company, employees, and maybe the owners and the holders, and consider other stakeholders. So what is the difference between primary and secondary, or the types of stakeholders? Primary stakeholders, we have decided that we want to have a relationship with the company. And as a result, we have established the conditions under which we agree to this particular relation. Yes, I'm going to receive a benefit from being here, and therefore I will be paying for this benefit. Or I'm going to be receiving a harm, but I'm going to be compensated for this particular harm. For the most part, we understand primary stakeholders as those with which the company has, quote unquote, a contract, explicit contract, employees. There's an employment relationship. I'm going to be working. I'm going to be tied to a company for my productive work, and in exchange, I'm going to be receiving a salary and benefits. I'm going to be running the company. I'm a manager, so it's not the salary, but maybe I have other types of incentives. At the same time, I'm not going to be working the 9 to 5 as certain employees, but I'm basically dedicated to the well-being of the organization, the shareholders, the owners, the suppliers with which the company establishes a relationship. You are going to be providing me with some desired inputs. I'm going to be paying for them, or the distribution. You are going to be providing me with some services so that my products can go ahead, and then they reach the customers, and I'm going to be paying for that. And then customers and consumers in which, hey, you are going to be buying this product because service because you like it, and therefore you are going to be compensating me for that. Different story with secondary stakeholders. In these cases, no, we don't have a formal relationship. We may not have come into an agreement in which we are going to establish a relationship, but nevertheless, we're being affected by the actions of the company. And this is where the role of externalities comes into play. And this is the notion that, well, I never agreed to basically interact with you, and all of a sudden, hey, I'm being affected. Why don't you compensate me? Or, hey, this is fantastic. I'm getting all these benefits and I don't have to pay for them. So it's a role of positive and negative externalities that drives these relationships, but we don't have a formal relationship. The local community, it might be good for the local community that a company is operating. Why? Well, there is employment. These employees are going to be not only working for the company, but they are going to be spending in the local community. There is going to be more economic activity. At the same time, well, there might be something negative. There is pollution, more congestion of traffic, positives and negatives, externalities. The government, of course, the government plays a role. It's nice that a company is providing economic development through employment and maybe infrastructure. At the same time, it's going to require infrastructure. It's going to require the support of the government. How do we interact with that company? Non-governmental organizations, interest groups. We want this particular company to tackle these particular and these issues that they are creating, or isn't it great? We are helping them develop these areas. The media, what's going on with the company, unions. Hey, it will be good if the labor has better rights. So we are going to have to interact with that particular organization. Governmental groups, interest groups, competitors, professional associations, kind of all the individuals and organizations that are directly and indirectly affected by the company and with whom, in many cases, we don't have a contractual relationship. How do we understand this? Well, there is, if you want an illustration, the onion model of stakeholder management. So we have the company in the middle. Around it, we have primary stakeholders with whom we have direct contractual relationships. Broader context, secondary stakeholders. Some companies take this to heart and they present it the way they understand it. So this is an example of a candy company from Sweden, a confectionery. And what do they do? Well, employees, suppliers, customers, shareholders, local community and consumers are what the company considers their primary stakeholders. And then you have the secondary stakeholders outside on the second ring, government, consumer organizations, the unions, industry, non-for-profits, stock exchange, banks, the media, and the schools and universities, and the government. This is a conceptualization of with whom we have a direct relationship, with whom we have a secondary relationship, and how we have to incorporate them in our decision-making. Why? Why should we care about this? Well, because we have two different ways of understanding relationships with other groups. There is the traditional shareholder view, in which the objective of a company is to maximize profits, value for shareholders. The assumption is that shareholders, the only thing they care about is profitability. Mostly coming from an economics finance tradition. The idea here is that, well, because we operate in a relatively efficient market, everybody else is compensated as long as we follow the regulations and the norms of behavior. We should just focus on creating value for shareholders because everybody is getting their fair share of the value that is created. If we maximize shareholder value, that means that everybody has been paid before we achieve this, so that's going to be good for society. You can think, well, this is not the reality. This is not how things work. That's why we have an alternative view in which, well, yes, this is nice. But the idea here is that we don't only talk about economics and maximizing profits, but it's fairness. How do we feel about it? Because the idea is that, well, markets actually are very imperfect. There isn't really a good mechanism that is going to compensate people for negative effects, or that is going to entice them to pay for the positive effects. There's going to be a lot of challenges in the operations of markets, and therefore we have to incorporate the desires of others. Validation. Shareholders, yes, this is one of the groups, but in many cases, and this is from the point of view, shareholders only provide capital, so why should they be the ones that are driving the decisions of the company? On the other hand, the shareholder view, well, we are the owners. If there are problems with markets, it is the government the one that has to basically solve those issues. It is not the role of the company. Two very different views in which, from a more economic or a more sociological approach, we understand relationships between the company and groups with whom they interact, shareholders. Who is the main leading shareholder? Stakeholder, sorry. Is it going to be shareholder, or do we have to incorporate everybody else's opinions? So this is the first idea. who is going to be setting implicitly the goals of the company, and then how do we within the company make sure that these goals or these desires are going to be achieved. That's the story of corporate governance. How do we manage the company so that we control the behavior of individuals and we end up achieving the goals that we have set? So contracts, explicit with many of the primary stakeholders for sure, implicit in some cases with the secondary stakeholders, and then who has the rights, the responsibilities, and who makes the decisions, and then how do we solve problems, and if the contracts are not basically enforced, how do we solve the disputes about the contracts. So this is a story of there is a broader objective. How do I make sure that I can coordinate the people involved here so that I basically provide them with incentives and the control and monitoring that enable me, as the person running this, to basically achieve those objectives. And then if there are disputes, how do I solve this? So implicitly, explicitly now, and there is a big theory, agency theory, which is also coming from economics. And the idea here is that, well, I have a principal and I have an agent. The principal is the one who is going to be hiring the agent to make decisions on her behalf. And because of this, I'm going to be providing you with incentives and monitoring so that the decisions are going to enable me to achieve the objectives I want. Some assumptions, lots of imperfect and asymmetric information, sensible one. Difficult to establish full contracts, imperfect contracting, also very sensible. Self-interested individuals, and this is, of course, from this particular view, it's an assumption. Some people question that it's always self-interested. They just want to maximize their own objectives, but we can basically get into that as an assumption for the model. And then there is a difference between agent and principal in terms of attitudes towards risk, which is going to drive the differences in decisions and primarily the story of differences in objectives. Yes, you want me to do something, but I also have my own objectives. Can I abuse the position you have given me to basically achieve my objectives rather than yours? And this is where all these agency problems are going to be coming into play. And that's why monitoring, control basically drives the story of corporate governance. So with this, different types of agency relationships, they exist everywhere. Although in general, in much of the theory, the focus tends to be between conflicts between owners and managers, yes, but there is also relationships between managers and debt holders. There is also the employment relationship, the superior with the employee. There is also supplier and distributor relationships. There is any situation in which there is an agency relationship. I'm asking you to do something on my behalf, and I have to reorganize a contract to achieve this. We basically end up with an agency relation. Now, what is the issue with agency relationships? Because of all these asymmetries of information, difficult to contract, and especially the story of differences in objectives, we end up in some cases with problems. Problems in which, well, I can't write a contract that enables me to make sure that everything is achieved. So therefore, there's going to be a conflict. I might have to do something more. And that's where the monitoring, which we'll discuss in a minute, is going to come into play. Important notion here, two different types of agency relations or problems. Adverse selection, the misbehavior, again, this is assuming misbehavior on the part of agent, is going to happen before I establish a contract. I don't know who you are, and I may basically hire you, and yes, I thought that you were so good and you were going to achieve all these things, and I realized, well, nothing is happening. You're basically playing off. You're not working as much as I expected, or you're not doing what I asked you to do. This is a before contracting asymmetries of information. I don't know you. I happen to hire the person that is not aligned with what I want to achieve. How do we reduce this? Well, screening processes. And this is typically what you are going to see in employment relationships. You're trying to look for a job. You present yourself as, well, I know these things. I'm graduating from this fantastic school, and I have been exposed to all these courses, and I have all this expertise I gained with some internships. And the company is trying to make sure that you are the right person for that particular position among all the different candidates. This is before they hire you. They are trying to reduce the information asymmetries, and they are making sure that you are going to be behaving as expected. Secondary set of problems, moral hazard, in which this is after we establish a contract, after I have hired you, after I have established a contractual relationship with a supplier. Well, I don't know what is happening. There is so much of information. You might be achieving other objectives, not the ones I want, and therefore I only observe at the end of a period that something happened. Maybe what I wanted happens, or maybe not. And is it because you were not working hard enough? You were not, my employee, for example, trying to achieve what I asked you to do? Or maybe I observed that, yes, it happened and you were not doing anything. You happened to be lucky. And then, yes, the market was very positive. It was growing, and then lots of good things happened. This is, I don't know what is happening after I have hired you. The story is a story of monitoring. Can I establish controls on your behavior? Can I see what is happening so that I reduce information asymmetries? So, two different types: adverse selection, information asymmetries, and before the contract, moral hazard, information asymmetries, and of course, potential misbehavior of the agent after contract. So going now deeper into solutions, especially on the moral hazard ones, what do I do? Monitoring, incentives, constraints, punishment. How do I basically make sure that you align your object? This behavior is aligned with what I'm trying to achieve. And the principal, you are the agent. How do I make sure that you are working towards what my goal is? Lots of different monitoring and control mechanisms. This is within the manager-owner relation. You can adapt them to other relationships. Internal ones, I'm going to the owner and the principal. You are the agent. You are the manager. I'm going to give you incentive systems so that, look, if the price of the company stock price goes up, I'm going to benefit. Is it going to be good for me? Internal policies of what you can do or you cannot do. Certain investment parameters. Yes, you can make decisions on these particular investments, but not anything big. Or no, you cannot buy other companies. You have to ask me as the owner if you're going to be buying companies. Some constraints on what you can do. There is an internal market for managers. Well, there is always a replacement, and people are competing against each other for promotions, so that might incentivize managers to basically behave according to the objectives of their principals. There is a board of directors that periodically is going to be meeting and evaluating what are the outcomes that the company has achieved, and whether management is basically doing the quote-unquote right thing for the shareholders. And then in some cases, big owners are going to have a large oversight over the behavior of managers. So it's not just periodic meeting of the boards, but look, if I control the company, most of the company is my own, I'm going to be keeping better track of what is happening inside. And then we have also external controls over misbehavior. Managers, again, assumption that this is the relationship we are discussing. Regulation, companies can do and companies cannot do certain things, and that's going to constrain some decisions. And there is also a market for corporate control, takeovers. If the company is not doing very well and there are no internal controls and the shareholders cannot do anything, well, maybe another management group thinks that, hey, that's a nice company. Why don't we just buy it, fire the management team, and then improve it, and we are going to create a lot of value. One argument, which is leverage. And the idea is establishing controls over what you can do as a manager by basically loading the company with a lot of debt, which constrains your ability to invest. And therefore, if you want to invest, you have to prove that that particular investment is actually going to generate a lot of value. kind of an extreme view, but one thing that has been argued. And in the product market, eventually, well, nothing is working and the company is doing very poorly. And if the products are not selling at the end of the day, well, competition is going to be taking care of the company and the company disappears. So some extreme ways of controlling managers, but the notion here is lots of different options within the company and also outside the company. One of them that is particularly, if you want, important within the management shareholder relations is the board of directors, because the board of directors is providing the oversight over managers, and it represents the owners. And yes, it's not only oversight, but in some cases, and this is different ways of understanding the board, they can provide a lot of knowledge and expertise to help with decision making. And then they can also use their relationships and contacts to provide another source, if you want, of help to the company. So it's not only a control system, but also can be a source of advantage on its own. Things to think about. Well, how do we have a mix of people representing management, internal versus outsiders? Are we going to have independent directors who are neither representing management nor shareholders, but kind of act as a, if you want, a separate third-party view, providing ideas to the company? What is the function that these individuals are going to have? What is the functional background? What is their expertise? Is it everybody coming from finance or everybody coming from engineering? Do we have a mix of functions here so that we have different views on decisions that are important for the company? Something similar with diversity in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of expertise. The notion is that we need some group of individuals that are going to be thinking beyond the day-to-day of the company, and because they are a diverse set of individuals with lots of expertise, they are going to provide alternative views that management, because they are embedded in the company, are not considering, and that's going to be good for the company as a whole. We also have to think about the structure. Do we include the CEO, Chief Executive Officer, within the board or not? Is she or he going to be also the chair of the board? So this is controversial because, well, how is the board going to control the management if the manager is basically the chair of the board and setting the agenda for the company? So in some cases, there is this idea that there should be a separation. This duality of the CEO chair doesn't really work well in terms of establishing the monitoring aspect. What are the committees? Who's going to be in the committees? Yes, there are some that are pretty much standard. There's an audit committee, what is happening with the accounts, and there is going to be a risk, and where are the exposure of the company? Remuneration, how do we pay the top leaders here? Nomination, if you're needing, and that's vary across time, because in some cases there is no need, but do we need new managers? How are we going to select them? There is also now a social and ethics committees, to basically sustainability committees, to understand the impact of the company on the outside and integrate it within the decision making. And then a final notion to think about: board interlocks. What happens with the same person is operating in multiple boards. On the one hand, it's good because you can get lots of exposure and ideas that are brought into the company. On the other hand, of course, the question is this going to lead to better decisions when somebody is so busy with all these commitments and all these meetings that eventually cannot devote enough time to better decisions? So lots of things, there are trade-offs in all of them, but the notion here is better decision-making within boards that is going to help the company achieve its objectives. How do we do this? Well, one suggestion, 3 principles. Yes, thinking about the long term, especially important for publicly traded companies, that every quarter they have to basically provide guidance of what is happening, and in some cases that pushes managers to be very short-term oriented, to make sure that certain standards are achieved in terms of the accounting and financing goals. So all of us are, well, let's bigger decisions, longer term, so that we are not basically just reacting what is happening now. Staggered boards, these are some recommendations. Staggered boards change every 3 years rather than once, and then basically not all the board at the same time, so that there is some continuity. And then try to reduce lots of losses that might distract people, so that it's just basically something that focuses people on the long term. Second thing is selection and the board. Who is going to be in the board? How are we going to be evaluating, selecting first people, integrating and evaluating, and then replacing them? Because once you are in a small group of people, you get into social relations. It's difficult to basically, in some cases, break those. And then tensions between management and owners. Can we basically establish a mechanism so that we don't get into fights, we don't get into proxy battles, but instead we are basically working together towards achieving the goal of the company. So with this, and these are a few ideas about corporate governance, the important thing here is understanding what is corporate governance, how do we achieve the goals of the company, how do we coordinate people. This is important within the broader discussion of stakeholders. Why? Because much of this, there is an assumption that it is shareholders, the ones that matter within the company, but there is the important idea that, well, it's not only the shareholders that are affected by the company's actions, stakeholders, everybody can be affected. Primary and secondary, the primary, yes, they are going to be agreeing to a particular relationship with a contract. With the secondary, there might not be such a contract, so we might, in some cases, have to integrate them because they are being affected by these actions. It's a story of externalities. And then how do we make sure that people are compensated? There is a fairness in the system so that, yes, it's not only value capture, but it's value creation for society and all the groups that are involved within the company. And of course, eventually, some value captured for the company so that shareholders are also compensated. But there is this tension between shareholders and stakeholders that then plays a role within corporate governance. How do we achieve the goals? Mostly driven by a story of agency theory. There's a principle, there is an agent, and the agent is going to be making decisions on behalf of the principal. How do I provide the monitoring, the control, the systems that enable me as the principal to ensure that what I want to be achieved ends up being achieved? Lots of different mechanisms, internal and external, and within those, in the manager owner relation, the big important role of the board and the idea that think about the long term, think about getting the best people, and basically have an orderly relationship. That's all. Thank you very much for listening.